Thank you all for joining. Ben, this should be a fun conversation. We're going to spend about 25 minutes chatting about the economy, and then we'll bring in a broader panel to discuss a little bit more broadly. And then we'll take, at the very end, we will take viewer questions. So please go ahead and submit those. Um, Ben, just to get started, it's obviously it's been a wild economic ride since the last election. We had the pandemic recovery, we had rapid inflation, we had high interest rates, and it seems like we're finally at the point of beginning to turn a corner on all of that. I wonder if, to start us off, you could give a brief overview of where you think the economy stands headed into this election.
Thanks. Yeah, it feels like a lot longer than 3.5 years since the last election. But we know it's just been that amount of time. As far as sort of an economic snapshot right now, I think that we're probably, well, I think we're in better shape than the economy is often given credit for. At the beginning part of the pandemic, we saw levels of inflation which were fairly rare for the U.S. economy. We saw this in the 1970s, for example, when it was longer and higher, the rates of inflation. But Americans aren't used to year-over-year inflation of 7, 8, 9%. But all in all, it was fairly short-lived. For some of the past 4 years, we had inflation that was driven by housing prices, which I think was sort of a unique problem that was different than some of the supply disruptions we saw at the start of the pandemic. But there's also been kind of this good news story, which I think a lot of Americans have underappreciated. There's been this major wealth boom in the country driven by rising equity prices and also housing wealth. There's been an unprecedentedly tight labor market, which has not only meant higher wages for many Americans, but also the opportunity to upskill your job. There's been this investment boom, in part driven by the IRA, but in part driven by an optimistic outlook by business leaders and CEOs. So the worst part of the economy over the past 3.5 years has undoubtedly been this bout with inflation that lasted for about 2 years. But other than that, everything has been really, really strong in ways I think is underappreciated.
Why do you think that is? Like, why aren't people appreciating it? Because what we see consistently is in consumer surveys and all the polls, people will tell you they don't feel great about the economy. It's very consistently, that's how people report their experience. I wonder what is causing the disconnect in your mind.
Yeah, so I think part of it has to be when prices are rising faster than we're used to, there's a chance that nothing else matters. Even if your wages are rising high enough to pay for those prices, the sheer salience of price increases, every time you go to the gas pump, every time you go to the grocery store, might sort of drown out some of the other good news. But I think a big part of this is a misinformation story. And Aaron Sojourner, who you're going to hear from later on in this webinar, I think has led a lot of research in this, and others have as well. But one thing which is not really up for debate is that Americans consistently misreport the macroeconomic outlook for the United States. So, for example, in 2022, there was a Morning Consult poll that asked Americans, are we in the midst of a recession? And in mid-2022, we hadn't been in a recession for a year and a half, and we wouldn't be in a recession for at least another 2 years. Half of Americans said, 48% of Americans said, we are in a recession. When you look at surveys of inflation, people regularly misreport the level of inflation. You saw about 10% of people saying it was around 20% or higher when the inflation rate was only about 3%. The mean response rate was that people thought inflation was 7%, again, when it was only 3%. So I think people are getting information from different sources. It's not just reputable sources, but it's looking to social media. It's looking to some news sources that I think can be regularly described as propaganda. And so I think that people are getting misinformation that's part of the story.
Right, makes sense. So you're saying they should all read the New York Times, clearly.
Yeah, I think people should go to fact-checked sources and reputable sources, the New York Times, NPR, Wall Street Journal. And you actually do see, the Michigan Survey of Consumer Finances has done a little bit of work on this, and you see that people's optimism and pessimism is highly correlated with where they get their news. And
Yeah,
so if people are getting it from social media and from other less reputable sources, they tend to be more pessimistic.
yeah. One thing that's been really interesting as a reporter who obviously covers this stuff is that when you talk to people about why they're feeling bad about the economy, they will often bring up housing. Housing seems to be a big part of this story, and the fact that housing affordability has gone down a lot and that it's difficult to buy a house at this moment really seems to be top of mind for a lot of voters. I wonder, where do you think our priorities should lie when it comes to encouraging affordable housing?
So I'm naturally prone to hyperbole, but I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that housing is our most severe economic problem that we face as a country right now. You can look at work out of Harvard that measures the share of Americans who are housing burdened, so who spend more than 30% or 50% of their incomes on housing costs. You see that proportion going up regularly over time. If you're a household and you're spending over 50% of your income on housing, that just crowds out so many other priorities. It means you can't spend money on education. It means maybe you'll be food insecure. It means that you probably don't have the opportunity to save for retirement. So I think that housing is probably our most acute economic problem. There's no silver bullet to housing. It's a really complicated problem. I think that the federal policymakers have begun to identify the problems in ways that are really helpful. And so one of the biggest problems with housing is that it's regulated at the local level. And some of those regulations feel contrary to housing affordability goals. I'm not someone who is a full-fledged YIMBY advocate, but it's pretty clear that the housing regulations are severely constraining new homes. And so when we look at the proposals coming out of the campaign, and I really haven't seen any proposals come out of the Trump campaign, but if you look at Kamala Harris's proposals, I mean, when she led with her first big batch of proposals, that was really a housing-focused set of proposals, which I thought was a fair nod to the severity of the problem. And she attacks both the demand and the supply side of the problem. And kind of the cornerstone of her proposals are A, to give incentives to local jurisdictions. She has this $40 billion housing innovation fund that doubles the size of a housing innovation fund proposed in a Biden budget. But the idea is to give incentives to local policymakers to help reduce some of the barriers to greater housing supply. And then she also wanted to double down on the low-income housing tax credit, which, look, is a highly imperfect subsidy for developers, but is also maybe the best tool that we have. So looking closely at her plan, it's clear that one of her top priorities is expanding the supply of housing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've done a lot of reporting on the proposal, and it seems like when you talk to economists, they'll say, good to focus on supply. This stuff is important. I've heard some doubts over whether you can build 3 million units, which is what they're pledging, and sort of the time frame allotted. And I guess there's also some questions about what the second pillar of that proposal is adding $25,000 in down payment assistance. And a lot of economists will say, if you don't build supply quickly enough, that $25,000 in down payment assistance is just going to go straight to prices. And I wonder what you think about that.
So on the first question, I think it's fair to say, is the $3 million goal realistic? I see that as an aspirational goal. If she gets to 2.5 million, does that mean it's a failure? No. We have a shortage of anywhere from probably 2 to 6 million homes in this country. So adding, 1.5 to 3 is a meaningful contribution. On the first-time homebuyers tax credit, I think that the narrative on this is not quite right. It's not wholly wrong, but it's not quite right. And so a lot of economists will just sort of wave their hands and say, no, let's get capitalized in the price of housing, as though that's like the end of the conversation. Let's not talk about that anymore. We've actually had an experience with the first-time homebuyers tax credit in 2008. It was $8,000. The economy was in very different shape than it was now. The housing market was definitely in different shape than it was now, but it provides some clues to what could happen in terms of housing prices and affordability with the first-time homebuyers tax credit. There's one study that found that it boosted new first-time homebuyers by about 16%. So a fairly substantial increase in people who were getting into the market who hadn't owned a home before. And it found that it raised median house prices by about 1%. So if the median house price is about $400,000 a year, for a new first-time home buyer, you have this 1% increase. It's worth about $4,000, but then you're getting $25,000 in a first-time home buyer's tax credit. So on net, you're reducing the cost of a new home by about 6%. At the same time, every incumbent homeowner would also see an increase of 1%. So you're talking about, I don't know, $300 billion in new wealth. So would it raise housing prices? Potentially, but first-time home buyers undoubtedly would be better off. Incumbent home buyers are better off because they see a boost in wealth. And the potential losers in this are people who've owned a home before but aren't current home buyers. So like every other policy, there are trade-offs. But if you look at some of the patterns around how difficult it is to get into a new home, the share of people who need to rely on family assistance in order to just afford the down payment, it's a pretty dire outlook for new home buyers. So I think you've got to do something on both the supply and demand side. The supply side is, I think, more important, but I also applaud efforts to look at people who haven't owned a home and who want to get into one.
Okay, interesting. The other really salient issue at the moment that voters will talk a lot about is the situation with immigration. There are obviously various suggestions out there that talk about what the approach will be to undocumented immigration in particular. But just starting with the extreme one, former President and Republican candidate Donald Trump has been talking about wide-scale deportations. I wonder how you think that would affect the economy.
It's tough to say because it's tough to imagine if you take him at his word, what it would look like to deport 10 million people. I mean, even things that already feel extreme, like workplace raids, are probably insufficient to get anywhere close to that number. So I kind of want to answer your question with a question, which is to say, I don't know what that means to deport 10 million people who are currently living on US soil. Does that mean going home to home, demanding that people show documentation of citizenship? Does that mean checkpoints on every urban major commuting route? Does this mean that, on buses that are stopped on the side of their routes and you have an ICE agent come in and check everyone's documentation? I mean, that would be wildly disruptive to the US economy. So if you take him at his word, I think that shifting from kind of free democracy to something that feels more like a police state would almost certainly be disruptive in ways that are really difficult to quantify. If you take him less at his word and say, look, we would probably see increased enforcement at the border, maybe periodic symbolic workplace raids, and not a lot else, then you're kind of in a world where you're looking at Goldman Sachs-like estimates where we're talking about maybe 500,000, maybe 250,000 fewer immigrants per year, which has economic consequences in its own right, but isn't as severe as shifting to an authoritarian state. So it's tough to answer. My guess is, and this was Goldman Sachs's guess as well, is that because of legal protections and other barriers to a full-fledged deportation of 10 million people, we're probably talking mostly about economic costs rather than these social costs. But who knows? I mean, who knows?
I guess in that sort of more moderate scenario where you do have some sort of at least deterrent for further incoming immigration, what do you think that does to the labor market, to prices? Like what are the knock-on effects from that?
Oh, I mean, as an economist, it's pretty clear about the benefits of immigration. There was one quote, I don't really want to attribute it to the person who said it, but it was, as he put it, 99% of economists, 99.9% of economists agree that immigration is good for the US economy, and the rest are Peter Navarro, which is to say economists across the board agree about the economic benefits of immigration. I mean, we're talking about increased jobs and economic growth across the board. Immigrants are not just workers, they're also consumers. Increased innovation. You see rises in patent filings and other indications of greater innovation. You see greater complementarity. Native-born workers tend to see upskilling in their jobs in markets with high rates of immigration. I mean, the economic benefits are pretty clear. In the context of the current labor market, which is feeling more balanced, I think maybe you can make less of this macro argument that we have these labor shortages across the board, like you could have made 2 or 3 years ago. But the long run benefits of immigration are pretty well established by the economics literature. So when we see a downturn in immigration, particularly from already fairly moderate levels, like we project them to be for the next 4 years, we're talking about, general long-term cost to innovation and economic growth.
Okay, interesting. Switching gears a little bit, the ongoing retirement of the baby boom generation is obviously already putting and will continue to put pressure on Social Security and Medicare in coming years. We haven't heard a lot about that in this election so far, but I wonder, what kind of changes to taxes or benefits do you think would be required to make Social Security and Medicare fiscally sustainable just going forward into the future?
Yeah, so every year, the trustees of Social Security and Medicare put out very detailed and extremely careful analysis. They did this under the Trump administration, they did it under the Biden administration. And the expectation is that the OASDI, so the Social Security and Disability Insurance Trust Fund, will be exhausted in under the next decade. And at that point, about 83% of benefits could be paid out as the program shifts to one with a trust fund to one that doesn't have a trust fund. For so many Social Security beneficiaries, if they saw cuts of 17% on average, that would be catastrophic. And nothing really determines old age standard of living more than Social Security. A lot of people are skeptical that that would happen, but my view is that ultimately the price has to be paid somewhere. And if we're talking about hundreds of billions in increased borrowing, that comes with its own set of economic costs. So, I would be in favor of Congress and administration coming up with at least a plan to address the shortfall. The hard part is not coming up with a plan. The hard part is coming up with the will to do it. The Congressional Budget Office has put out dozens of possible remedies to the long-term Social Security trust shortfall. I don't think you have to close the whole 75-year actuarial balance in order to claim victory. Even closing half of that would be monumental. And I think that people that study this on both sides of the aisle, reasonable people, can agree that there's some fairly modest solutions that wouldn't be terribly disruptive to the program. So just to take one example, I mean, if you took reforms that increase the share of wages that were taxed under the Social Security payroll tax from about 81, 82% where it is today up to 90% where it was intended to be when the program was created, so that 90% of wages were subject to the payroll tax. And you couple that with fairly modest changes to the benefit formula. So for example, going from 35 years of earnings feeding into your Social Security benefit calculation to 40% of earnings and a few other fairly modest things, you could close about 60% of the long-term shortfall. And so my sense is that at some point you'll see the will of Congress to come together in a bipartisan way. It probably has to be bipartisan and implement a series of relatively modest adjustments to both the tax and the benefit side and close, 40 to 60% of the long-term shortfall. Now, how and when that happens, I have no idea. But the fact of the matter is, to answer your question directly, there are reasonable incremental solutions on the table. It's just a matter of passing them.
Okay, interesting. Another thing that is getting a little bit more conversation this election season is the idea of Fed independence. It's obviously generally prized by the institution. It's generally prized by outside economists. I guess I wonder, from your perspective, what would it mean if we lost some of that independence? And is there a scenario in which actually more White House Fed collaboration could be a good thing?
Yeah, great question. First of all, I'm not sure that Fed independence, I mean, you've written a book on the Fed, Fed policy more than virtually anyone else I know, but we have historical examples of times when that independence has been surrendered and the costs are pretty severe. And so if you had a situation where the economy is running at full employment and you saw a big tax cut or a big spending increase that overstimulated the economy, and you had a Fed that wasn't independent, that was a captured Fed, the costs would still accrue, but they would just accrue in different ways. So rather than seeing, a tightening of interest rates, we would see costs being paid in the form of widespread inflation. And so it's not really a question of whether or not the costs would be paid. It's more of a question of how those costs would be paid. And the cost could be fairly substantial. So the Budget Lab at Yale has done work on this. Ernie Tedeschi has done work on this. And if you get a situation where consumers' expectations around inflation become de-anchored, and you start seeing these sort of consumption responses that happen when people start expecting inflation to increase down the road, you could see inflation go up as much as 1% per year, according to their simulation. So I think that the key point is that that a credible Fed is really good for the U.S. economy. And that was one of kind of the remarkable things that happened over the past several years, was even in the midst of all this turmoil, the Fed maintained its credibility. And I give great credit to Jay Powell and the rest of the Fed for doing that. But if we get to a situation where you see coordination between the White House and the Fed loses its credibility and inflation expectations become de-anchored, the answer is that anytime we start seeing the economy overheating in any way, the cost will be paid in terms of higher inflation rather than higher interest rates. And that has pretty terrible consequences for consumers across the board.
Yeah, absolutely.
Your second question was, is there a better way for the White House and the Fed to become coordinated? And that's a really good question. I mean, I think the firewall between the Fed and the White House is just incredibly important. So my knee-jerk reaction is to say no, but I think there are certain circumstances that do warrant transparent and regular communication, and those circumstances are when we're in the middle of a crisis. So during the SVB crisis, for example, I think that was a crisis that played out over the course of just a matter of days, and I think that coordination was warranted in that circumstance. Going back to 2007 and 2008, there was obviously coordination between Treasury and the Fed under both the Bush administration and an Obama administration. I think that coordination was really good for the outcome. So I guess I would say, in general, that firewall should be maintained and protected. But in instances when we see financial crises, there are benefits of coordination.
Okay, absolutely. I think that is all of our time for this portion of it. So thank you so much, Ben, for taking the time.
Thank you.
Great to hear from you. And then we are going to go ahead and bring in the rest of our panel. So we will switch over here. While they are joining, I will just go ahead and introduce them all. Susan Helper is a professor of economics at Case Western Reserve University. She served as senior advisor for industrial strategy at the White House Office of Management and Budget during the Biden administration and chief economist of the Commerce Department during the Obama administration. Neera Palma-Rao is an assistant professor of business economics and public policy at the Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan, and a former senior economist at the Council of Economic Advisors, where she served in 2015 and in 2016. And finally, Aaron Sojourner is a senior researcher at the W.E. Upjohn Institute for Employment Research. He has served as senior economist for labor at the U.S. President's Council on Economic Advisors during the Obama and Trump administrations, and has also held a number of other public service roles. So I think the panel is all here now. I will go ahead and kick off. Actually, we're going to kind of break this conversation into two big chunks. We're going to talk about stakes for workers and families in this upcoming election, and then stakes for businesses. And then at the very end, we will get to audience questions. So go ahead and send those in. Starting with the workers and families point. Sue, I actually wanted to start with you. We have been talking a lot in this country over the last couple of years about industrial policy. And I wonder if you think that, to what degree do you think that what we have been doing policy-wise has been industrial policy, and are there opportunities to push it further?
Yeah, well, I guess I think that currently there is an industrial strategy in the sense of, an actual plan to affect individual industries. That doesn't mean in the past we haven't had strategies that affect industries. It's not an accident that we've been strong in aerospace for a long time because of our emphasis on the military. But today I think we have had, as exemplified by the infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, a coordinated action to transform the economy, including through efforts designed at particular industries. And so this is different than what traditional economist prescription is. You want to be agnostic. You want to have a tax credit for all kinds of business investment, not investment in particular industries. You want to have, if at all, you have anyway. And so I think in contrast, the theory behind what the Biden administration has been doing is that, well, no, there's actual real bottlenecks and information gaps, and if you can address those directly, you can get a whole lot more progress made. So just one example is that there's studies that suggest that $1 invested in EV charging has as much effect on demand for electric vehicles as $12 in a direct subsidy for electric vehicles.
Interesting. And Aaron, on this topic of industrial policy, one goal obviously behind in implementing something like industrial policy is about improving job quality. And I wonder if you could speak to a little bit, whether mandates like prevailing wage requirements have been effective at doing that, and whether there are trade-offs when you have aspects like that to those policies.
Yeah, we've had in prevailing wage laws since the Great Depression in the construction industry for federally funded and state and local funded construction projects, and it's meant to ensure that when a big buyer of labor comes into a market for a big project like the government, that they don't exercise that market power to push down wages and job quality. It recognizes that the public has a lot of market power as a buyer and indirectly as an employer. And that's true across a lot of sectors. So I think the evidence is pretty clear that those kind of standards that say, we're going to compete this job out, but we're going to compete it out with sort of compensation standards fixed. So managers are going to have to compete on quality and other aspects of efficiency besides reducing labor compensation. That it does improve labor compensation for workers in those sectors. It does raise job quality, so it's successful in its sort of main goal. The concern is, well, does it boost costs a lot? Does it reduce quality? Does it promote inefficiency? And there have been studies of that in construction. There hasn't been a very clear evidence that these unintended consequences come out. I think there's some estimates and they are around zero. So we're going to learn a lot in the future from the rollout of these new policies, but that's sort of the base of evidence we have now.
Okay, interesting. And while Sue, I'm going to stick with you for a minute. Actually, I'm going to come back to you about and stick with this topic of industrial policy, and then Nirupama, I have a question for you after that. But Sue, I wonder, you mentioned that there is this granular element to some of the industrial policy we've recently been seeing. I wonder, from your perspective, does it matter that the U.S. government is sort of focusing on specific industries, and does it matter where the specific activity is happening? Like, does the design here have big implications?
Yeah, I mean, I think the administration has chosen industries, where there's particular market failures, as economists, so helping a particular industry has broad benefits to society. So I think clean energy is a place where, we have this climate problem, and it's both been politically infeasible to pass a carbon tax, and I would argue that a carbon tax by itself doesn't get at these particular bottlenecks. And I think the kind of theory of the case that we can do almost as much with these targeted policies actually has some, so far anyway, some evidence behind it.
Oh, that's interesting. What evidence, what do you see as the signs of success
twofold. Here? One is there's a study by the Clean Investment Monitor that suggests that every $1 of public investment has been met with $6 of private investment. That was in FY23. So somehow we are unlocking bottlenecks. We are making it clear that there's profits to be made. That's the first thing. The second thing is a study by a bunch of authors, including Catherine Wolfram, that shows that actually, if you look at some of the incentives in the IRA, they're actually not all that different than what a carbon tax might have produced.
That's interesting. That's interesting. And we will come back to those in a minute, but I wanted to actually move on to the issue of tariffs for a moment. Nirupama, obviously tariffs could potentially be used as a sort of alternative, blunter approach to industrial policy. And so I was hoping, Nirupama, that you might be able to sort of walk us through, do tariffs create jobs? How might across the board tariffs change things for US workers? Just, how do you see these fitting into the policy space?
I mean, in short, do tariffs create jobs? No, they don't. Really careful research by David Otter and David Dorn and their co-authors has actually looked specifically at the tariffs that were passed during the Trump administration. And they found unequivocally that the tariffs put in place on things like washing machines and imported metals like steel led to no increase in US jobs. And worse yet, the retaliatory tariffs, which are the natural consequence of our protectionism, is our trading partners putting up tariffs against our exports. Well, those retaliatory tariffs actually did cost jobs, specifically in the agricultural sector, where we saw China put up large, substantial retaliatory tariffs on cotton, soybeans, and other agricultural products. So no, it doesn't create jobs. And I think this is a place of real disparity between the campaigns, where, I think this is an area where former President Trump has been very clear. If he was elected, he would seek to raise tariffs. He's talked about a 10%, even a 20% across the board tariff rate, a higher rate, 60% on Chinese imports. I mean, I think the key is that our trading partners are not just countries we import from. They are some of our most important export markets. You can ask American farmers. And this is true for Europe. It's true for other trading partners. A more closed world economy is not going to be better for US workers. I mean, as an aside, I think some people also think that these tariff measures might help the trade deficit. I mean, whether you think the trade deficit is a problem or not is, kind of in the eye of the beholder. But I also think that even if you are worried about the trade deficit, I'm not sure these measures really do a lot. It would, of course, reduce imports, reduce exports. I think there's a good argument that on net, these measures would strengthen the dollar, which would make our trade deficit position worse. I'm not sure you can even argue it from that angle as well.
One interesting thing that we've been doing a lot of reporting on, and that I think a lot of people are asking, is these tariffs, the tariffs that former President Trump is talking about, do not look exactly like the ones that he enacted in his first term, right? 10% across the board is very different from sort of slightly more surgical tariffs that we had previously seen. I wonder how you think that would affect that kind of design, like if it were this blunt blanket, how that would affect the outcomes from these tariffs.
I mean, I think because they're talking about across the board tariffs, I think the price effects are going to be much more clear, right? These tariffs will make things more expensive. It's going to make inputs more expensive for our manufacturing firms. It's going to make final goods more expensive for US consumers. And all of those price increases are going to build into inflation. Mark Zandi of Moody's has estimated that on net, 10% across the board tariffs, and maybe lower than what's being discussed at times now, would lead to inflation rates that are 75 basis points higher than what we see otherwise. So it's going to raise the cost of living. Estimates suggest that translates into the equivalent of like a $3,000 or $4,000 per household tax hike. And these will be regressive, right? Just like a retail sales tax, across the board import tariffs are going to hit working families harder than higher income families. Families who are fortunate enough to save a good chunk of their income are just not going to face the tariff rate on that income. So any dollar of income taxes, and our income tax system today, for the various tweaks we might want to make to it, it is fairly progressive. So any dollar of income taxes you're replacing with tariff revenue, you are adding a more regressive dollar to the tax revenue picture, because it's going to fall on families that spend a great deal of their income, working families, much harder than on families who are fortunate enough to save quite a bit.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's a really interesting point, which also kind of leads me nicely into the next topic we wanted to talk about, which is what the tax regime might look like in the next administration. We are obviously talking a lot about using tax credits. And Aaron, I might actually go to you with this question, but we've been talking a lot about how tax policy could sort of improve outcomes, and in particular, talking about increasing the generosity of the child tax credits, especially for families and newborns. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what lessons we should take from the pandemic era expanded child tax credit about the potential effects of a permanently more generous credit.
Yeah, thanks. We greatly expanded the child tax credit, and it greatly reduced child poverty. So in 2020, childhood poverty rate was around 10%. In 2021, with the CTC expansion, it cut in half to 5%. And that was the lowest level on the records going back to 1967. So, that was a huge change in income and prosperity for a lot of families with children and young children growing up. Then we saw that it wasn't renewed, so the expansion was pulled back. So in 2021, 5% poverty, record low. In 2022, it more than doubled, up to 12%. So, it's pretty clear evidence that it directly affects poverty. Beyond that, we saw there have been good studies of what happened. How was that extra money used by families with kids? And families increased purchases on food, increased spending on child-related expenses and household necessities. And we didn't see much in terms of difficulty paying rent or bills, but we did see increased spending on debt repayment. In terms of employment effects, which is another concern, broadly, we didn't see much impact at all. If you look across, all families with young children, for unmarried mothers with low education and with the youngest children, who are the demographic group that's sort of most affected, there was evidence of a cutback in labor supply. There was no clear benefits or impact at all on sort of parent mental health, but it likely improved child health and well-being in the short run, and it evidence it did, and probably in the long run it will. Had the biggest impacts on kids from more disadvantaged families. Not much impact on the health for kids from less disadvantaged families. In terms of policy design, something that was kind of unique during this expansion was like a real emphasis on getting the money to families quickly and easily. And so they did full refundability. So you didn't, it got to the most disadvantaged families. They looked at advanceability. So you got the money every month, and they took down barriers to claiming. And that really seemed to make a big difference in terms of getting the money to the families that needed it and would otherwise be missed. So those are some really important policy design lessons from the 2021 law.
Do you think there's anything else about the way the policy was structured that we should sort of take away going forward that would inform sort of best practices for how you would want to design a more extended, more permanent version?
I think there's questions, again, like I think the refundability, advanceability, low administrative burdens for claiming, like these are hard problems to overcome, but we did it pretty well, and it was a big lift. And so those lessons and those systems that were built are there, and we're hopefully going to take advantage of them. I think there's a question about, should the benefits go bigger benefits to families with younger children or things like that. I think there's some reasons for doing that. There's other things one could do with money besides a cash credit. You could do childcare subsidies. You could do other kinds of things. And there's some evidence that Childcare subsidies have bigger impacts on children's development than cash. Cash makes the parents better off, but doesn't necessarily make the kids better off as high quality care subsidies do. So,
yeah, interesting. Narapama, switching gears just slightly, another hot topic in taxes at the moment are whether some types of income should be exempt and whether we should sort of tweak what types of income are exempt. Social Security benefits are already partially exempt from income taxes, and that could become complete next year. And then income from tips could also be exempt. I wonder to what degree, what difference could exempting these kinds of tax make for a typical person? And then B, what consequences, are there any unintended consequences that those kinds of tax exemptions could have?
Well, I think the first thing to understand is that, Social Security benefits are really widely received, right? 67 million people in the US receive Social Security benefits, and about 40% of them pay some tax on those benefits. And let's be clear, they pay taxes on those benefits because their income during retirement has risen above a threshold such that part of their benefits are taxed. Not collecting taxes on the Social Security benefits of these higher income households, will mean less revenue. And I think a statement like, let's exempt Social Security from taxation is a popular, but at the end of the day, it's kind of an election year gimmick, but it would have very real consequences for Social Security. Right? If we actually exempted all Social Security benefits from taxes, it would move up the insolvency of Social Security by 10 years. Put differently, a study by the Urban Institute said, that kind of change in insolvency date is the equivalent of cutting benefits for the median recipient by nearly $6,000 in 2045. That would throw 3.8 million seniors into poverty, and it would cut the incomes of the lowest 40% of retired households by a fifth, right? When you're already that far down on the income scale and you're living on a limited income, a 20% cut is a really big difference in your living standard. But moreover, we'd be sacrificing the long-term viability of Social Security to give tax cuts to households who, Social Security is a very small piece of their income picture. Just to make it clear, if you are a Social Security recipient who has less than $32,000 in income during retirement, you'd see no tax cut. If you have between $32,000 and $60,000 in income, you'd save $90. In dollar terms, the biggest winners from this tax cut would be the 0.1% of earners. They would receive an average tax cut of $2,500. But these households have incomes of over $5 million a year. Does $2,500 mean very much to them? Did they need it enough to want to raise Social Security to make retirement harder for so many other people? I think that's really the trade-off we're talking about when it comes to Social Security. There are things we might want to change. We might want to talk about indexing when the tax rate kicks in for inflation. We might want to think about the 7 million proposals in Washington think tanks about tweaking this inflation indexing or changing the threshold for taxation, et cetera, et cetera. But I think when it comes to fully exempting benefits, the costs are really high. Now, quickly, you mentioned the tips idea too, right? It's been talked about on the campaign trail, like, tipped workers, let's just not tax those tips. The first question is exactly how many tipped workers do people think are facing big tax bills, right? So we can turn to the BLS. The BLS tells us that half of wait staff make less than $32,000 a year. At that kind of income, you're facing a tax bill only as high as $1,900. And that's only the case if you can't get the child tax credit or the earned income tax credit. Parents largely qualify for both, and that's wiping out their tax bill. So outside of the very top earners in this profession, according to the BLS, the 90th percentile of wait staff is earning $60K a year, right? So that's maybe where the tips are starting to outpace cash income, and maybe where this proposal would actually lower tax bills. But even for those workers, it's not clear to me from an economic efficiency point of view or a fairness point of view why a person who works in a tipped service industry should face a lower tax bill than someone who earns the exact same income working in a warehouse, right? To me, this exempting tips idea, it feels more to me like a way to reduce pressure for raising the minimum wage, right? And for maybe including tipped workers in that minimum. And that's a policy that would actually improve the economic well-being of all tipped workers. And research by me and numerous other economists has found that, raising the minimum wage doesn't have the impact on business that people fear. And my own work has shown that even when it comes to small business owners, the minimum wage isn't really detrimental to their bottom line. And so even the small businesses that are often used to scaremonger about the minimum wage aren't really impacted by sort of a broader policy to help these workers.
That's interesting. And I guess I wonder, specifically when it comes to the tip minimum wage, it's obviously set much lower than the federal minimum wage, under $3, whereas the federal minimum wage is $7.25. Is that changing that a delta that large? Does that matter, or does that fit in within sort of the research, which shows that raising the minimum wage doesn't matter much?
I mean, in my own work, which looks at small firms, we actually examine state minimum wage increases from 2014 that did not have a lower tipped minimum for tipped workers, a lower minimum for tipped workers, and we don't find detrimental effects among restaurants. They basically offset the added wage bill costs with new revenues. The consumer pays with slightly higher prices, is what we find.
Okay, interesting. And Sue, I wanted to come back to you with a final tax question, which is different kind of tax credit. The IRA obviously supported consumer markets for electric vehicles by removing limits on tax credits subsidizing their purchase. That was intended to support the transition to EV production by domestic manufacturers. And I wonder if you could walk us through a little bit whether you think that plan has worked and whether consumers are buying EVs as a result of it. I wonder if you could just kind of walk us through how you think about that.
Yeah. So the president in August of 2021 set a goal that by 2030, 50% of auto sales in the US would be EVs. And we are on track to meet that goal. There's been some hype that, oh, no one wants EVs. And what that is generally a confusion of a decline in the rate of increase of demand for EVs versus an actual decrease. So what we're seeing is that EV demand is slow. The increase in EV demand is slower than it was, but we're still ahead of projections that were made in 2021. And part of this is the popularity of the plug-in hybrids, which were actually included in the original goal. And there's a lot of projections that things are going to improve a lot from the EV space in the next couple of years, in part because of these kind of interlocking policies. So there's one of the bottlenecks was EV chargers. That's been slow to roll out, but those problems should begin to be alleviated probably by the end of next year, according to the International Energy Agency and BCG. There's also a large decline in battery prices as we get better at making them. So, I feel like we're on track to meet this goal. It's a very important goal in the sense that electric vehicles are increasing that share is really important to meeting our climate goals. And I also say that I think that the targeted tariffs, the 100% tariffs that President Biden announced on Chinese vehicles, are actually important to retaining that progress. And so it's true. I think it is a tax on consumers, as Niruparma said, but I think it's well offset in this particular case by some benefits. And so the first thing I'll notice is these are targeted. They're combined with other policies that promote innovation by companies, promote investment. We've seen this 6-fold increase in investment in batteries, et cetera, rather than just rest on your laurels, which is one of the things you worry about with tariffs in general. They also offset problems, I think. So particularly incredibly high subsidies in China, and some of those subsidies are in dollar terms, so free land, cheap capital, but also in terms of suppression of wages, suppression of environmental things. And so this is a policy that I think will have benefits in terms of, we have a sort of infant industry of electric vehicles in the US. It will benefit that industry and benefit the workers in that industry. I think leading it to be a long-term beneficial policy, because it's not a standalone policy, but is combined with these other issues.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I guess going back to the tax credits, if the EV tax credit were repealed under the next administration, would the market for EVs be able to sustain itself at this point? As you mentioned, it is still sort of an industry in its infancy. I wonder if it can stand on its own feet at this stage, or does it really need those tax credits?
No, I think it does. A couple of arguments that people intensely feel kind of range anxiety. They are not familiar with EVs. Once I, as a driver of a plug-in hybrid, typically buying Econo boxes, once you drive them and feel like, wow, there's acceleration, you don't want to go back. So as consumers get familiar with these benefits, I think things will change. But right now, we're kind of asking consumers to take on an unfamiliar product, to pay a higher purchase price, so that they have these economy-wide and environment-wide benefits in terms of reducing our carbon emissions. And so I think that the tax credits remain really important for that goal.
Okay, interesting. And we're going to take a brief step away from taxes, although we will come back to them on the business side. But Erin, I wanted to just briefly, sort of before we get back to business taxes, talk about another big topic at the moment, which is competition. The FTC and DOJ have recently stepped up antitrust scrutiny of proposed mergers, including in cases where the alleged harms associated with the merger came from the firm after merging having too much power in the labor market. I wonder if you could sort of walk us through how businesses might benefit from relaxation of that heightened scrutiny for mergers. What would it mean for companies if this sort of pulled back a little bit?
Yeah. There's a lot of evidence that we've under-policed mergers and permitted too many mergers from a social and economic perspective. So this recent increase in enforcement activity has challenged that. To some extent, I don't think it's closed the gap in terms of what's needed, but it's moved in that direction. So a relaxation of scrutiny in the future would give more permission to firms to concentrate, to merge, to boost profits, give them the market power to boost profits at the expense of, first consumers in terms of higher prices and lower quality, second workers in terms of reduced competition between employers and lower compensation that flows from that. And then third, entrepreneurs who are, struggle to enter a market against entrenched, strong incumbents. Economists have done a ton of studies of what happens post-merger. And what they've found is that, like hospital mergers are some of the most studied, and they involve both consumer side and worker side harms, potentially. And they've found price increases on the order of 20 and 30% post-mergers in mergers that are allowed to go forward, have been allowed. But it varies across markets. A scholar, Peter Kwaka, went back and looked at dozens of mergers that were reviewed beforehand and analyzed, and they thought they would be fine, but looked at what actually happened afterwards. And they found, over 100 products analyzed, found that prices went up on average on the order of 4 or 5%. And in particular, of the mergers that resulted in price increases, the antitrust authorities only had investigated or acted to try to block them in a minority of cases. So even if you only look at the cases where prices went up, the enforcement activity was missing for the majority of those cases, which suggests substantial under-enforcement. Similar analysis by Simon Mungy, Eric Posner, and Kyle Herkenhoff and co-authors looked at the labor market side from mergers and reducing competition between employers and reducing workers' pay. And again, found that evidence that enforcement is too weak, there's not enough review. So, relaxing the little bit of heightened scrutiny that's been happening stands to reverse some of the progress that's been made on these fronts.
Interesting. And I guess, it's 2024, so I have to ask you about grocery mergers because they are the hot topic at the moment. The Harris campaign has been talking about sort of in some way cracking down on the food industry in order to address rising grocery prices. Is that a thing that could potentially work in the short run? Like what would a crackdown in that space look like? I wonder if you could kind of walk us through what you think about that set of ideas.
Well, I think there is evidence of substantial concentration and market power in certain kind of choke points in the food supply chain. I don't know that it's general all the way through, but there are places where there seem to be big issues where you can look and find, there's thousands of producers, but there's only 4 buyers, and there's evidence of anti-competitive behavior and practices and market power that harms those suppliers, that harms the downstream consumers and the workers. And antitrust authorities have been investigating these, and they've gone after anti-competitive practices in the supply of sugar, in the supply of meat processing, agricultural processing, poultry production, and others. So, this isn't make-believe that there's market issues here. Promoting competition can reduce prices. These kind of antitrust enforcement actions and policy can reduce prices, probably not immediately, but over time. But taking an aggressive stance on enforcement can deter bad behavior, even in the short run, by increasing the risks of acting in that way. So
it seems like, as a reporter who's been covering this administration, it seems like a lot of this is already in train. We've been talking about sort of cracking down on the meat companies, for example. Is there more to be done here? Like, are there obvious places where there's unfinished business in your mind?
I think that this area is just getting started. Like, the agencies have very limited resources, and we have a vast economy. I mean, we have a lot of firms making these decisions all the time. And again, there's evidence from the labor market and from the product markets that enforcement is too low, that there's that there's mergers proceeding that are building market power in ways that we don't want them to. So I think there's plenty of scope to expand. We've made some steps in this direction, but I don't think there's any evidence we've hit the point where we want to be.
Okay, interesting. Sue, I'm going to hop over to you. We are, while we're on the topic of supply chains and prices, the pandemic really highlighted the importance of maintaining supply chains for some critical goods and materials. And we obviously saw the disruptions in 2020 and 2021 lead to increased costs and delayed production. I wonder if you could walk us through, whether in your mind supply chains are fully normalized and whether there are particular materials or industries that remain vulnerable to the kind of disruption that we saw.
Wow. Well, I guess I think there's sort of 3 aspects to supply chain resilience, and we're making some progress on all 3 of them. So one is visibility. Do you even know, who your second or third tier suppliers are? And companies have been making some private investments in that. We also see the government, so the Department of Commerce, HHS, and DOE, Department of Energy, making some investments in learning about that. Way more is needed. The second you might call redundancy, having extra sources of supply, holding more inventory, you see more of that. The problem with that one is it's costly. And it can undermine, if you have too many suppliers, you can undermine the kind of trust and collaboration that you need to really solve problems when they occur. And so I guess my favorite resilience method is agility, where you actually try to reduce your lead time so you can respond quickly to any kind of problems that occur. And that depends often on, broadly trained workers and collaboration with suppliers. And I feel like we've made less progress on that. I think there's some understanding of the importance of this. So one of the key reasons for the chip shortage, and that, that added a percentage point to inflation and cut a percentage point from GDP, was a failure to communicate between the auto industry and the chips industry. The auto industry did not, thinking they were going to get these older discounted chips forever, where they could just freely go ahead and double the number of chips per car without really telling anybody. So anyway, there are now, I think in part because of the administration, there are now regular communication on that particular issue. But that's not to say that there's new problems that could occur. I'm particularly worried about a new pandemic. We haven't done a great job of coordinating, for example, supply and demand for personal protective equipment. You think of it as a kind of a commodity, except, during a pandemic when nobody wants to export their PPE, and we've put a bunch of money in to stand up some producers, but haven't done a good job of coordinating demand and finding demand for those folks. So progress has been made, but still a lot more to go.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And, obviously the chips, I think, was an eye-opener for a lot of us in realizing how extremely limited that supply chain was and how extremely limited the production capacity was, and what a choke point there was there. I guess I wonder, there's been so much investment and so much effort to sort of build out domestic capacity there. I wonder, is that happening in the right places? Is it working? Is that supply chain more resilient? Like, how do you think the chip story in particular is playing out, and how resilient is that going forward?
Well, so, if you look at the total amount of money in the CHIPS bill, like about 50 billion, it's actually less than Intel spent on stock buybacks and dividends over the last 10 years. So, it's improving our financial system, conceivably, could change it. But on the other hand, the National Institute of Standards and Technology has set forth, some ambitious goals when the act was passed, and they're actually meeting all of them in terms of, setting up investment, and thinking about the whole supply chain. So not just the leading edge chips, but the legacy chips that maybe are more reliable, less tiny, but cheaper and more reliable, the kind of thing you use in many car applications, automotive applications. You Also, I think one thing to the competition point, there's a clever, and I hope it works, thing that, if you're going to give money for the chips industry, there's essentially three big companies, Intel, Samsung, TSMC. You're now going to, it's government money to strengthen them and give them more market power. Do we want to live in a world like that forever? Well, no. And so part of the CHIPS Act goes to set up a commons where there is time on in fabs for startups to try out new technology, new product designs, etc. And so hopefully, we'll not be locked in this world of three, and we'll have a few more options around chips. So it's a very long-term project, but I think there's been decent progress. And actually, if I can say one more thing about the childcare, that got a lot of play as what, like this is kind of the everything bagel. But I think in this case that companies had been facing labor shortages, and it's not just chips, it's elsewhere, that they had not solved, and the kind of their model about how to operate, and where workers are a cost, and you can't, you don't take into account the fact that paying a higher wage is going to ease your recruitment problems and increase retention and all this kind of thing, that when you have companies with perhaps mistaken business models, that this kind of nudge, and it was actually only a nudge, you just had to have a plan, no comments about what the plan had to be, but that kind of a nudge, I think, was actually effective.
Yeah. And I will actually ask you one more, and then I will let you get off the topic of chips. But it's an interesting topic. Clearly we all discovered a very important topic. But I guess, obviously this is a long-term project. We've got a lot of policies in place. Is there anything missing from the set of policies we have in place at this stage? Is there anything that you think still needs to be done or still needs to be enacted to make sure that this supply chain is resilient into the future?
So I'm not a complete expert on chips, but I will say that, some areas that I would look at, the legacy chips, these kind of older, is an area that China has really doubled down on and, could be a new source of vulnerability, I think is a first thing. A second thing is packaging, which sounds very simple, but a lot of it is done in Malaysia. So you may make the chip here, but then it gets sent to Malaysia. So now you've got, oceans involved in your supply chain. And so there's some money in chips for that, but I'm not sure there's enough. And then the third thing I think comes back to this theme of overall coordination. One of the issues again in autos, which I do study, is that each because of the way the industry developed, there's lots and lots of individual chips in most cars. Tesla's different, but most cars. So your windshield wiper has a chip. Your seat adjuster probably has several chips. Is this the right way to organize cars? It's a kind of one-time big change that has to be made, probably by a bunch of automakers at once. And would be costly because you need different kinds of designers, different kinds of, do we have in place the right kind of communication that would make that kind of, nonlinear change happen? In both, autos is one example, but there are probably other cases as well.
That's interesting. Okay. Pivoting away from chips for a moment and going back to taxes, Nirupama, I wonder if we could talk a little bit about business taxes for a minute. Some of the most substantial changes in the TCJA were on the business tax side. Republicans would obviously like to make those changes permanent, and Democrats would at least like to partially roll some of them back. I wonder if you could sort of walk us through what you see as the main effects of the TCJA corporate tax changes on businesses, just so we can kind of have the framework to think through that policy difference.
Sure. I think the key impact of the business changes in the TCJA was to reduce revenue, and to reduce revenue substantially. Based on data from public firms, so firms that report their 10Ks publicly, we see that the TCJA cut effective tax rates by 9 percentage points on average. That means, across, you thinking about just collections across the business sector, across the corporate sector, including privates and publics, revenues fell from the corporate sector from about 375 billion prior to the TCJA to about 250 billion after. So we kind of lost about a third of corporate tax revenue. Corporate tax revenue was like, 1.8% of GDP. It's now more like 1%. So it's been a very big change. The best research suggests that all of this lost tax revenue didn't actually incentivize an equal amount of corporate investment. We would have literally been better off writing corporations checks for all the investment they did versus cutting taxes in this way to help them see the worth of investing. So it hasn't been a roaring success. And you might remember during the passage or the sort of the fight to pass the TCJA, there were these arguments about how if there's more capital in place, workers will be more productive, they'll see income gains. And there were numbers like a $4,000 to $9,000 gain per year for the typical worker. And none of that actually materialized. Again, the best evidence suggests that all of the income gains on the worker side went to executives and the very highest paid of employees. 90% of workers saw no income gains from the TCJA. So on net, it really just cut business taxes. There were various pieces of this, right? There's the GILTI and the FDII and the, the international stuff that tried to create a stopgap to create sort of a minimal level of taxation on foreign income and move our tax system to more territorial from worldwide so that income is taxed sort of based on where it's earned rather than applying everywhere. And the net impact of all of these things was to just reduce the tax burden on the corporate sector. We can talk about the private, about pass-throughs as well, or, we could end it there.
Yeah, I do have a question about pass-throughs, but before we get to that, I actually wonder if you could just sort of walk through what you think a world would look like in which we repeal some of the things the TCJA would did, and what a world looks like in a world where it's extended and made permanent.
So, I mean, I think there is a sort of growing consensus on the center and the left of center around, rather than having a corporate tax rate of 21%. Keep in mind, before, like in 2016, the corporate tax rate was 35%. So it fell substantially. I think there's a growing consensus around a number like 28%. And, I think one way to think about what would happen, so we didn't see any major economic response in terms of real economic activity to the big tax cut. So what would happen if we asked for half of that tax cut back? I would say not much. But I think one thing that it would give us is capacity for stabilization policy during a downturn, right? If corporations are paying the bare minimum when times are good, right? Corporate profits are up. We have less to offer them in a way when times are bad to sort of keep investment in place, to keep workers in place, to keep the corporate sector afloat. So, I think given the evidence we've seen about the big tax cut, I don't think we'd have a lot of real economic activity curtailed if we asked for half of it back. And it would give us sort of more stabilization power in the future.
Okay, interesting. And then, as promised, back to pass-throughs. TCJA created a 20% deduction for pass-through businesses. I guess I wonder if you could walk us through the public policy value of having that deduction in place.
So I think the motivation behind that 20% tax cut, right, for pass-throughs. So pass-throughs are businesses where instead of paying the corporate income tax, all of the earnings in the year, all the profits flow through or pass through into the individual incomes of owners and are taxed on the individual income side. So I think part of the motivation of offering that 20% deduction for pass-throughs was to maintain some parity between the corporate C Corp sector and the pass-through sector, right? So C Corp saw this massive 14 percentage point reduction in marginal tax rates. Let's offer something to pass through businesses as well. But again, from the research that is emerging about this policy change, again, we've seen that this was largely a transfer, a giveaway, in the sense that it didn't really yield any real change in economic activity. When it comes to investment, wages to workers, or employment, we honestly didn't even see a lot of reorganization of businesses across the pass-through versus C Corp margin, which I think people thought we might see. So we didn't actually see a lot of response in terms of economic activity. But I actually think this moment, when we're thinking about what the future of tax policy looks like, I think thinking about pass-throughs is actually really important. And it's worth thinking about what that pass-through income is. First, I think it's important to realize that this is not a small amount of income. The majority of business, and I'll explain why I use quotes in a minute, but the majority of business sector income is actually through pass-throughs at this point in time. So it's a big slice of the tax base. But we actually need to ask how much of this pass-through income is truly what we would call business income. Business income being sort of the returns on capital, the returns on innovation, but specifically not labor income, right? And research by Eric Zwick, Owen Zadar, and others has shown that a substantial portion of pass-through income is really just labor income that's been recharacterized into pass-through income to have a lower tax rate. So this is income earned by private equity workers, by high-end lawyers, by really top-earning doctors. It's really just labor income. And it's being sort of taxed at this lower pass-through rate because there is a lower pass-through rate for taxation. And so, I think we fundamentally need to think about how having these tax advantages for pass-throughs is motivating this relabeling, this shifting of income in only those jobs that can actually manipulate this margin. So it's not a tax break we're offering everyone. And how having lower pass-through tax rates sort of motivates this relabeling. In other words, instead of trying to think about pass-throughs and tying their tax rates to C Corps, I think it's important to acknowledge that a lot of what's being taxed is labor income. And instead, we should be thinking about tying that pass-through tax rate to the top rate on individual income, because that's really the margin of response we're seeing, that relabeling or shifting of income from the individual side to the pass-through side to gain a favorable tax rate. So that's sort of what I think of as the important aspects of that deduction when we're thinking about revisiting how we structure pass-through income taxation, corporate income taxation.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, this is going to be my final question before we move on to audience questions. But Aaron, I wanted to move back to you for a minute and ask a quick labor market policy question. There's this ongoing policy debate over the circumstances under which a worker should be classified as an employee versus when they should be classified as an independent contractor. I wonder if you could walk us through why it matters to a business which of those two categories its workers fall into, and then also how businesses might adapt to policy change that would cause more workers to be classified as employees.
Yeah, thanks. Businesses care because contractors have fewer rights than employees, and so employers can reduce their labor costs by 15 to 30% by treating a worker as a contractor instead of as an employee. Like, our whole system of labor rights rests on the foundation of employment. Those guarantee a worker's right to overtime pay, to freedom from racial discrimination in hiring, pay, promotion, to a safe and healthy workplace, to unemployment insurance, Social Security, the right to work with your coworkers to advocate for job improvements without getting fired. All those rights only attend to employees, not contractors. So contractors can avoid, so employers, if they're paying their workers as contractors, they don't have to pay workers' comp premiums. They don't have to pay UI premiums. They don't have to pay the employer side of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid taxes. So they just get a big cost advantage on labor against their competitors who maybe are treating workers as employees. So that's the fundamental reason employers care, buyers of labor care. From a social perspective, I think the question is, look, there's a bundle of rights and responsibilities that are the right to earn a profit off of discretion, the right to control the actions of the worker, and the liability if the worker does something wrong. And we should couple that package of things together, and we should either give them to the buyer of labor, so that's employment, or we should package them together and give them to the seller of labor. That's contracting. And we need to think about, in this circumstance, which of those parties does it make sense to have that bundle of rights and responsibilities? That's the real policy question, but it gets very diluted very quickly into can I lobby to get the law, or can I just act in a way and not get caught to get those cost advantages, to thread through these enforcement regimes, and get a competitive advantage against other employers by misclassifying.
Sorry, that's interesting. And are there particular industries or particular types of businesses that might find themselves needing to make big adjustments if we classified more workers as employees, for instance?
Yeah, I think the places that would probably show up as the biggest change are the places where we see a lot of the contractors, and we see a lot of variation across states and stuff. So construction, transportation, personal services, hair salons and things like that, and agriculture are all sectors where you see a lot of people who in the past would have been employees now being contractors. And in terms of workers, EPI has estimated so I'll stop there, but yeah, that's good. So
okay, interesting. Okay, so we are going to switch over to audience questions. We've got a couple. The first is for Nirupama. The question is, do you agree with Trump's electric vehicle tariffs? And for what other sectors would the panel recommend tariffs? So we'll start with Nirupama and then maybe sort of move across.
Well, I think Sue really explained it extremely well and extremely clearly, right? That in the electric vehicle sector, there are these externalities in part, right, to the climate and such from or gains from avoiding the negative externalities of polluting vehicles, but also that we're countering sort of non-market measures by other countries, namely Chinese support of their industries in this area. And so, and there can be reasons to sort of combine tariffs with incentives or tax subsidies to sort of promote infant industries. And I think when it comes to EVs and more broadly the CHIPS Act, there are also some national security concerns that also create incentives for these targeted tariffs combined with supportive policies. And so I think, I think I can be persuaded that industrial policy in targeted ways can be an important part of sort of building a strong American economy. I think the question we always have to ask ourselves is, at what point does the government not know that something is worth creating tariffs around or creating support through tax policy for? Because there's always going to be industries interested in signing up for these policies. And I think we need to know where we stop or what is our line. But I think when it comes to EVs, I think Sue has made an excellent case for why this was an area where industrial policy made sense for the US to engage in.
Yeah. And Sue, I wonder, given that it was your point originally, like, are there other places, are there other infant industries that you think we should be protecting with these kinds of protective tariffs?
I'm thinking about this. It's a really great question. And I guess I think there's two reasons why there are among which there are some reasons why you might think that international price levels are not efficient. One is in the case of a strategic industry, and people are going to come up with examples, but I'm not thinking of any right now. The second is a case where, as Nirupama was talking about, there's a lot of non-market activity and subsidies either, and those subsidies, I want to emphasize, can be either in terms of actual money or they can be in terms of suppression of labor and environmental rights, which also reduce costs. And in those cases, what you might do, we have a system for dealing with those. It's called the Anti-Dumping Countervailing Duty, AD-CVD, a program that allows companies to argue that they are the victims of unfair competition. This system works badly. First of all, it's it's the responsibility of the company to make the case, and small companies don't have the couple $1 million it takes to make the case, and big companies may not want to because they're going to antagonize, they may well have facilities abroad or export or whatever. And it also takes forever. And so by the time you show and document injury, it's too late. A lot of plants have closed. So, and this happens in these surprising industries. So when I was in the administration, we heard from the Syringe Association that China had, all of a sudden was making this play for syringes and, mislabeling things as being of the brand and quality of an American company and charging 30% less, and the hospitals didn't know. And so if this system worked better, then you wouldn't actually need the kind of separate tariffs. So I guess my major plea, this would be, some kind of reform of this AD-CVD system.
Maybe a better name. Yeah. And I wonder if you have thoughts on this. Are there specific targeted tariffs that you think are? No, we're getting a no from Aaron. Okay, great. That's good because we have another question that gives us time to get to it. From David Mitchell for Dr. Rao, if C corporations should be taxed at 28%, what top marginal tax rate should pass-throughs be taxed at? And should the qualified business income deduction be retained, or should pass-throughs be treated differently at all?
So I think this is an area where my thinking has evolved in recent years. I think we have this idea in economics and public finance specifically called the Haig-Simons definition of income, right? And it's like any change in your ability to buy things, we should count as part of your Haig-Simons. It's kind of an ideal measure of income. And I think of a lot of sort of tax policy economists and even practitioners as having what I call Haig-Simons aesthetics, where we'd like things to look a certain way because of the way we think about the ideal measure of income. And I think that Haig-Simon's aesthetic has led to me, before sort of thinking, well, pass-throughs and C corps, they should be kind of close together, would just look nice and symmetric in the tax code to have them that way. But I think while I can see the theoretical arguments that we would worry about the reclassification of businesses across the C corp and pass-through form, I think empirically we've seen relatively little of that. You got to be a C corp to access public markets. So I'm not sure everyone's going to go private and give up the ability to raise capital through equity or bond markets. And instead, I think we need to think carefully about that top marginal tax rate on individual income. And so I guess what I'm saying to Mr. Mitchell is I might be ready to cut loose and not tie the pass-through rate to 28% on the corporate side, but to think harder about what the top tax rate is on the individual side. And maybe it doesn't have to match the combination of 39.6 on individual income plus the Medicare surcharge folks are talking about. Maybe it's more in the range of 35 or 34, but I think it's time to sort of unpeg ourselves potentially from the C corp tax rate.
Oh, very, very interesting. I don't think we really have time for another question, so I think we will wrap it up there. Thank you guys so much for a really interesting panel. There have been some really interesting, we obviously have done quite a tour of the current issues in economics and economic policy. And with that, I will turn it over to Kevin to wrap it up.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gina, for outstanding moderation today. This concludes our webinar on the economic policy stakes for 2025. Thanks again to Ben, Sue, Nirupama, and Aaron for their thoughtful participation. Thanks to many of my Equitable Growth colleagues for making this event possible. Thanks to all of you for joining us. I hope you found this discussion as interesting as I did, and I know I'll be thinking about a lot of what people said today as we learn more about the candidates' priorities over the coming weeks. A recording of this webinar will be shared with everyone who registered. So if you know someone who would have been interested in this conversation but couldn't make it, please do share that with them when it arrives. If you're interested in hearing more from Equitable Growth, you can find our work at our website, equitablegrowth.org. We've got a big tax policy report coming in a few weeks that I'm sure will be of interest to many of you. So thanks again for tuning in.